In our last lecture, we saw storm clouds gather over Europe in the period from 1933 until 1939, when all the promise and hope that had accompanied the end of the First World War began to end in what would become an even more tragic and devastating struggle. We saw Britain led by Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain. Now, these were not good, decent men trying to do the best they could in a difficult situation. They were politicians in the most odious sense of the word. Their concern was for their office and staying in that office. They could lie to a nation. They looked the British people in the eye and said, "We are militarily prepared." Their concern was not losing elections. And Stanley Baldwin would say in absolute frankness that had he spoken frankly of the disparity between British strength and German strength, he would have lost the 1935 election. And the extraordinary thing is, Baldwin did not see anything bad in that statement. To him, this was just politics. These were men who would be at home today in our political world. And if anything, Neville Chamberlain was worse than Baldwin. He had a self-righteous air to himself. He was from a distinguished political family. His father, Joseph, his half-brother, Austin, were politicians of great dimension in Britain. Neville was not raised to be a politician. He was going to be the business side of the family. He was a failure at it, but he went on to become Lord Mayor of Birmingham and rose to be Prime Minister through municipal government. And that was always his attitude, the pinch-minded attitude of a bookkeeper and mayor. At the height of the controversy over King Edward and whether he should abdicate, rather than seeing this as a constitutional crisis, which it was for Churchill, here was a king being forced to abdicate without the matter ever having been discussed openly in Parliament, simply being forced to abdicate by the Prime Minister. This didn't bother Chamberlain at all. He was simply worried, as he told Baldwin, that this ongoing controversy might affect the Christmas trade. Let's get it settled as quickly as possible so people will spend a lot for Christmas and not be worried. He was utterly incapable of understanding Hitler. He had no grasp of the dimensions of Hitler's mind and the dimensions of his grasp for power. But he also had the attitude that other people's freedom didn't matter. Czechoslovakia was a faraway place of which we know little, so give it away. And as Churchill said, you think that you have sold honor and bought peace, but you have sold honor and bought only war. And indeed, in March 1939, Hitler would break every one of his promises made at the time of the Munich settlement in September of '38 and seize what was left of Czechoslovakia. It was this blatant treachery that finally began to shift the mood in Parliament. And in the course of that summer of 1939, now belatedly realizing that war was all but inevitable, Chamberlain blundered again. It was possible, as Churchill said over and over again during those months, to make an alliance with the Soviet Union. No one has spoken more harshly against communism than I have, said Churchill, but it is a question of priorities. We must make an alliance with the Soviet Union. That alone will check Hitler. But Chamberlain did not like the Bolsheviks. And so without making an alliance with the Soviet Union, did push Britain into an alliance with Poland. And both France and Britain guaranteed Poland. And so Stalin turned where he could and made a fateful alliance with Adolf Hitler. This then opened the way for Hitler's invasion of Poland on September the 1st, 1939. And war was declared Britain and France declared war upon Germany. And so barely 20 years after the end of the First World War, an utter defeat of Germany, again, war. The demand for Churchill to be included in the government had grown over the summer. Newspapers and Parliament, it was demanded over and over again, Churchill must be part of the government. Chamberlain delayed as long as he could, and finally on September the 3rd, asked Winston Churchill to become again First Lord of the Admiralty, that position that he had lost in the wake of the Dardanelles catastrophe of 1915. And Churchill came back to that office. And there was a secret cabinet that he opened up, and there were the maps just as they had been the last day he was in the Admiralty, all the ships. And he would write, "Once again, after a quarter of a century, we faced mortal danger at the hand of the same foe. Once again must Britain draw the sword in defense of a small nation, outraged and invaded. Once again we must fight for life and honor against all the might and fury of the valiant, disciplined, and ruthless German race. Once again, so be it. So be it." And he began to direct the Admiralty. Now, he had not been totally admired by all ranks in the Navy. There were men in the Navy who still remembered how, when he was meeting with the chief admirals in 1915, and they told him, "You are outraging the traditions of the Navy." He said, "The traditions of the Navy are rum, sodomy, and the lash. Good day, gentlemen." But he was a man of the hour right now, and all over the British fleet, the signals flashed out, "Winston is back." And he began to take sure direction of the Navy, even as he had done in 1914 when the war broke out, the First War broke out. In the meantime, nothing much happened in terms of Britain and France fighting Germany. They sat still, week after week, while their ally Poland was overrun. Now, France had the largest army in Europe, well equipped. It had a large air force, but it did nothing. And the gallant Poles went down to defeat, to be enveloped in a dark period of servitude and vicious tyranny unsurpassed in the history of Europe. Millions of Poles dying under the Nazi tyranny in the years to come. And their allies did nothing, only enhancing Hitler's belief that the Allies would, in fact, not fight. They had not fought at the Rhineland. They had not fought for Czechoslovakia. And France had a direct alliance with Czechoslovakia. And now they had not fought for Poland. And then the winter began to settle in over the front. What the newspapers would call the phony war, or the Germans would call the Sitzkrieg. They had had the Blitzkrieg, the lightning war that swept over Poland, and now they had the Sitzkrieg, where they just sat. And while they prepared, and Hitler worked to the finest level his plan for the invasion of Western Europe, the French army and its morale deteriorated. After all, the Soviet Union, the communists were allies of the Germans, and communist sympathies were strong among many Frenchmen, and so the morale declined and declined. And Neville Chamberlain continued to believe that everything was okay. And on April the 2nd, he made the most remarkable, in retrospect, statement to the Parliament, a statement which shows his complete lack of any grasp of what was going on. Herr Hitler, he said, had missed the bus. He'd missed the bus. He wasn't going to do anything. He'd let his opportunity pass. Well, Churchill was one of several cabinet members who were determined for action. The Allies should do something. And so a small action was begun in Norway in an effort to prevent Swedish iron ore from reaching the Germans. They needed that iron ore. Norway was neutral, Sweden was neutral, and the iron ore was coming down through Norway. So the British started an naval action with some landing of troops in April 1939. And then suddenly, the Germans invaded Norway. They invaded Denmark, and in a matter of hours, the Danes had capitulated, and Norway was under attack, and Oslo was occupied. Herr Hitler has missed the bus? Hardly. The defeatism in Europe was such that the Danish king, surrendering after only a brief few shots had been fired by his guards, then said to the German general, I surrender, and might I say as an old soldier, it was a smartly carried out exercise. What an extraordinary statement. And so Denmark fell under the conquered nations. The Norwegians fought with bravery, but they could not resist. And the mood in Parliament became ever more angry. And the situation in Norway was going to be the center of a strong debate in Parliament. And as Chamberlain got up to begin his comments, the Parliament began to seethe with anger, and words were heard like, go, 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 and he could barely complete his speech. And then a long-standing member of Parliament, Leo Amory, said, quoting Cromwell, when Cromwell had dismissed the Long Parliament so many years before, "You have sat too long," speaking to Chamberlain, "for any good that you have done. Let us be done with you. In the name of God, go." And as Chamberlain left Parliament, there were those who feared for his physical safety as members of Parliament crowded around him, singing "Rule Britannia" and "Go, go, go, go." Chamberlain was about to resign when suddenly, that May the 10th, German troops invaded Holland, Belgium, France, and began to sweep through the Low Countries. That morning there was an extraordinary shock throughout Britain. Churchill was awakened on the telephone to hear of this news. And Chamberlain then said, well, maybe I had better stay on. It would be wrong to resign in the midst of this crisis. I had better stay on. What I think I am going to do is form a national government. I want the Labour Party to join us. And he asked the head of the Labour Party, Clement Attlee, if Labour would be willing to serve in his government. And Attlee said, I will have to check. And it is easy to check because we're having our annual convention right this moment. My suspicion, however, is they will serve under a conservative prime minister, but not under you. And that was the answer. We will not serve under Chamberlain. And so the question was, that fateful day, who will be prime minister? Churchill or Lord Halifax? These were the two obvious candidates. Lord Halifax was the foreign secretary, a distinguished man who had served as Viceroy of India, a solid proponent, solidly in favor of appeasement, appeasing Hitler. He was also another one of these men who was not decent. He was an anti-Semite, and that played a significant role in his desire to appease Hitler. But he was the favored of King George. He was a sound man, not impetuous like Churchill. And King George, like others, believed that Halifax was the man to make a negotiated peace with the Germans, and that was all that was possible, to make that negotiated peace which would keep Britain's empire and let the Germans dominate the continent. Churchill and Halifax spoke on that day, speaking together privately, and Halifax understood how delicate this situation was. His goal, as we mentioned in our first lecture, was to allow Churchill to become prime minister, allow Churchill to make the inevitable negotiated peace with the Germans, to be tarnished by it, to have to step down, and then Lord Halifax would become prime minister. That's clever thinking. So he said to Churchill, I think it would be highly difficult for me to guide Parliament and guide the Commons from the House of Lords, because he was a lord and peer of the realm, and he sat in the House of Lords. Churchill didn't say a word. For once in my life, he said, I was silent. And then Halifax said, I think you are probably the better man. Again, I said nothing. And so it would be Churchill who was called to King George that evening to be asked to accept the prime ministership. "I don't suppose you can imagine why I called you here," said King George. "No, I cannot, Your Majesty." They chuckled a bit, and then Churchill assumed this great burden. On the 13th of May, he spoke to Parliament. "All I have to offer," he said, "is blood, toil, tears, and sweat. We," he said, "at this moment are faced with the greatest crisis in our long island history. You ask, what is our policy?" For, of course, that is what little mini minds are doing at a stage like this, running around. What is our policy on this? What is our aim? What are we up to? You ask, what is our policy? It is to wage war. It is to wage war by sea, land, and air. It is to wage war with all our might and with all the strength that God can give us. It is to wage war against a monstrous tyranny, unsurpassed in the lamentable catalog of human crime. You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word. It is victory. Victory despite all costs. Victory despite all terror. Victory no matter how long and hard the road may be, because without victory, there is no survival. Let that be understood. Without victory, there is no survival for the British Empire and all that empire has stood for. So do you see, he has answered those who say we can make this negotiated peace. That would be to destroy what makes the empire special. Can you grasp that? Why keep the empire, which is what Lord Halifax wants to do, if the law and liberty, if the civilization that that empire represents vanishes? And so it will. But the idea of a negotiated peace had not died. Hitler was quite convinced that Britain would make a negotiated peace. Various reasons are given why Hitler, having driven the British and French to that narrow spit of land called Dunkirk, after the Belgian king had surrendered, why Hitler did not send in his armor. He had plenty of tanks that could have crushed that army there on the beach and annihilated it. He did not. He was certainly persuaded in part by Hermann Goering, who wanted the glory of his Air Force, his Luftwaffe, winning the final stage of the battle. Hitler also had ideas that went back to the time of his own service in Flanders, of how difficult that terrain was. But another crucial element was that this would be a kind of understanding with the British that he had not utterly destroyed their army. And so, the evacuation of Dunkirk began, starting that May the 27th. Hard and heavy tidings Churchill thought he would have to bring. But the tanks were held up, and the Luftwaffe was unable to stop that evacuation, that brave little fleet of Royal Naval vessels, of garbage scows, of an American yacht that ferried 336,000 British and French troops to safety. But at the very moment this evacuation was going on May the 28th, there was a critical meeting of the cabinet. 2 days before, the French minister had come to London to say, we cannot hold out. We are collapsing and we will surrender. I see no other course. And this cabinet meeting was held to discuss what to do if, in fact, the French surrendered. And you've got to understand the shock of this. The French army was thought to be the most powerful army in Europe, and it was in utter rout. How could this be? In 1914, they had fought on for 4 more years. And now it seemed as though within a matter of days the Germans would be marching down the streets of Paris. And the reports that came back both the official reports and private reports. Churchill had a close relative who was fighting in France, and he brought back. And the report of the utter absence of fighting spirit among the French troops. And Churchill's own discussion with the French leaders. How utterly shattered they were. So this was the situation. And so Churchill met with his cabinet. And Lord Halifax insisted upon a negotiated peace. We have already set up through the Foreign Office lines of communication with Mussolini. We will offer Mussolini significant strategic gains in the Mediterranean, almost certainly giving him the island of Malta, a key naval base of the British. In return, Mussolini, who was not yet in the war, will intercede with us and Hitler. He will arrange a conference, and we can make this negotiated peace. It is the only way. We cannot win. Well, most of the conservative members of the cabinet were quiet. Neville Chamberlain was still a member of the cabinet. That is another example of the magnanimous spirit of Churchill. He kept Chamberlain on. Churchill polled his cabinet. Neville Chamberlain said, well, we must listen to this now. Lord Halifax spoke again very strongly. And the two members of the cabinet who were most utterly opposed to this idea of a negotiated peace were the Labour members. Above all, Clement Attlee. And they backed Churchill to the hilt. Churchill said, I must ponder this. I would like to call a meeting of the entire cabinet, not just the ones concerned with the war, but all 25 ministers. They came in, and Churchill spoke and said, I will never make a peace with that man. You must understand that. No matter what happens in France, we will fight on. If the long history of our island nation is to end, let it end when each one of us lies choking in his own blood on the ground. And suddenly, members of cabinet leapt up and ran around and began to pound him on the back. Nothing like it had ever been seen in the somber atmosphere of British politics. And he had it. He knew that Britain would fight on. And so he would address Parliament on that fateful June 4th day, bringing news that 336,000 British and French troops had been evacuated, and give those ringing words with which we opened our lecture, that although large parts of Europe and many old and famous states had fallen or might fall into the odious grasp of the Gestapo, the apparatus of Nazi rule. You know, he never pronounced Nazi the right way. Remember, he wouldn't learn German, that beastly language. And he always called them Nazis. To call them Nazis would be to give too much dignity to them. All the odious apparatus of Nazi rule. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and on the oceans. We shall fight with growing strength and confidence in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And so he spoke to the British people. So he spoke to Hitler, who thought there was going to be a negotiated peace. And so he spoke to America. To a Roosevelt who was hearing from his ambassador, Joseph Kennedy, that the British were not going to fight. So Churchill spoke. He'd already spoken to the British people in his first broadcast as Prime Minister. I speak to you, he said, in a solemn hour for our country, for our empire, for our allies, and for the whole world. Do you see, this was no small local war. It was a war for the very soul of mankind. Behind us, he said, lie shattered nations and bludgeoned races. The Czechs, the Poles, the Norwegians, the Danes, the Dutch, the Belgians, and he would soon have to add the French. Upon them will descend a night unbroken even by a star of hope, unless we conquer. As conquer we must, as conquer we shall. We shall. We are going to win. Today, he said, is Trinity Sunday. Centuries ago, words were written to be a call and a spur to the faithful servants of truth and justice. Arm yourselves, and be ye men of valor, and be in readiness for the conflict. For it is better for us to perish in battle than to look upon the outrage of our nation and our altar. As the will of God is in heaven, so be it. Ancient words rallying a people to one more great struggle. He would later say modestly, it was just my job to give the roar to the British lion, and perhaps from time to time to show that lion where his claws might be set. But he was more than that. He was a leader who took a doubtful people with every reason to believe they could not win and made them rally and fight or die. What has been called the Battle of France, he said, in June of 1940, is about to end. And I expect the Battle of Britain is about to begin. Hitler knows that he must break us on this island if he is to win. This evil man, this repository of so many forms of soul-destroying hatred, this embodiment of ancient wrongs and shames. What a description of Hitler. And he thinks he is going to terrorize us by his bombings. What he is going to do is to light a fire that will ultimately consume him until we, hand in hand with the New World, already talking about the Americans are going to have to get into this, hand in hand with the New World, will march to victory and rebuild the temple of man's freedom upon a foundation that can never be overthrown. This is a solemn hour, he said, in the cause of freedom. And that is what we are fighting for, not national aggrandizement, but for freedom, for the individual rights of every man, woman, and child in this world. We are not going to lose, and what we are fighting for is right. And so the bombing of Britain would begin. It would begin in June and July as Hitler laid plans for an invasion. It began with the shipping in the Channel. It then moved to the airfields of the RAF. And then finally, starting on September the 7th, 1940, to the indiscriminate bombing of London and other cities. Thousands of dead. Massive destructions of cities. And unlike Hitler, who later on never visited a bombed city in Germany, he was too sensitive for it. Churchill watched the bombers coming in, refusing to stay in his bunker, and every day walked the streets of London or visited other bombed cities, talking with the people who were suffering, holding up his sign, V for Victory, and saying, "We can take it." On August the 16th, the heaviest flight of German aircraft yet came over. Churchill was at fighter headquarters. He looked at the table and said, "We have no more reserves if the Germans send over another flight. It only took 6 minutes to cross the channel. What will we do?" And his air marshal said, "The men will just refuel and go up again." And he got back into his car late that evening. His aide started to say something to Churchill. He simply put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Don't say a word. I am too moved." Never before in the course of human conflict have so many owed so much to so few.